This is all theater. This is all just political theater.
Political theater. Political theater.
Pure political
theater.
Theater.
Political theater.
The nefarious,
Significant and protracted
Political theater for political theater's sake.
I yield back.
From Washington, this is Political Theater, Roll Call's review of the spectacle of politics on Capitol Hill and across the country. I'm Jason Dick. Congress returned to Washington this week, looking to finish up long overdue business in a lame duck session. Among the deadlines are funding for the government, which is more than 2 months late and has an expiration date of December 20th, a measure to authorize agricultural programs, or a farm bill, which is already 1 year late and likely will get some kind of extension into a second year, and the annual bill to authorize defense and national security programs, as well as several other miscellaneous health and tax policies. It is even money that many of these measures will also just get short extensions into the new year, so even the swearing in of the new Congress and a new president next year won't provide a fresh start. They'll have to deal with leftover business before getting down to new business. This begs the question, is this the best we can expect from Congress? And if not, what are some of the ways that Congress could make things function at least a little better? That's a tall order for any organization, much less an entire branch of government. So we're going to start small and discuss ways just one branch of Congress could make things work a tiny bit better and without having to move heaven or earth or, heaven forbid, pass legislation to do so. Molly Reynolds, Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institute here in Washington, D.C., makes it her business to think about these things and propose solutions as she joins us on Political Theater to talk about some home improvements that could be made to the House. Molly, welcome back to Political Theater.
Thanks, Jason. It's good to be here.
Sorry about the very long intro, but I think just because we took a break for Thanksgiving, I feel like we have to, balance it out. But we've talked on the podcast before, and this may be a little bit of a departure. We're usually talking about something that's sort of in the air, or some bouncing off some news, frequently also with our friend Niels Lasnewski. But I think maybe end of the year. These aren't New Year's resolutions, but I like to think about okay, we've got a new Congress starting, the 119th Congress, a new president. I mean, it seems like we're always in this place in December, not just after an election, but frequently where, people they just have all these deadlines. The holidays are coming up. Everybody's cranky. And I and other people wonder, what did you do with the rest of the year? I mean, I used to teach, and that was a frequent question to my students. What have you been doing all semester that you need an extension?
Yeah, I often talk about the U.S. Congress in the context of, college freshmen everywhere, that they are often incapable of acting without some sort of major pressing deadline, although as you outlined in your intro, some of this December's deadlines are likely to actually get extended into the new year. In the case of funding for discretionary federal activities in the form of a continuing resolution that might take us into, I think, March is the kind of going expectation. Things like the Farm Bill that might get a full 1 year extension, that sort of thing. So we do often seem to be having this conversation about, what is Congress's ability, what is Congress's capacity to address the things for which they are responsible. And we often have this conversation at the end of the calendar year, and sort of we often also at this time at the end of one Congress and looking ahead towards a new Congress, talk about and think about possible changes to the way particularly the House operates. So when a new House is convened to start a new Congress, so in next January, that'll be the 119th Congress. One of the first things that the new House always has to do is adopt a rules package. The vast majority of what'll be in that rules package will carry over from the previous U.S. Congress. But it is always a time when folks kind of sit down and have an opportunity to think about possibly making tweaks to the way the chamber works. And sometimes it's a time when groups of members choose to kind of exert some of their influence and possibly demand possible changes in the way the House works. So, we saw this, we've seen this actually on display a number of times in the past decade or so. At the end of 2018, looking ahead towards Democrats assuming control of the chamber after the 2018 midterms, when Nancy Pelosi was trying to build support to be reelected speaker, she had to make some kind of procedural concessions to some folks in the Democratic caucus. And then 2 years ago, in January of 2023, during the marathon attempt to get Kevin McCarthy elected speaker, short as that speakership was, he had to make a whole series of procedural concessions to blocks within the Republican conference. And again, I think looking ahead to next January, we already have heard some discussion about possible changes in the rules to the provision that allow members to use a question of privileges of the House to remove a speaker, that sort of thing. So this is not a new conversation, but it is a familiar time to be having it.
Absolutely, and I think that one of the things that I found so fascinating, because we thought McCarthy would have trouble securing the speakership on the first vote. We didn't anticipate more than 15 votes for that. And what I think the public certainly might have been mystified by was that at that time we didn't have members of the House. We still, because nobody could be sworn in until we had a speaker, and we also had no rules. I mean, it really was potentially anarchic, like that there were no rules, there were no members, there was no leadership. The person running one half of one branch of government was the clerk of the House. So an unelected, staffer, senior staffer, very important staffer.
As we look back at the 118th Congress, it did, particularly in the House, did have some real moments of parliamentary unprecedentedness. That's not a word, but unprecedented parliamentary moments. There we go.
You know what? It is now. I'm reading. This was my project for the year, is to read Life of Samuel Johnson by Thomas Boswell, and I'm in the big parts where he's trying to finish up the dictionary. The English language evolves. We're adding words all the time. We're stealing words outright from other languages. We have, more than 600,000 words in the English language now. That was not the case in the 18th century when Johnson was doing his dictionary. I love unprecedentedness.
Well, we saw it in January of 2023 with the sequence of votes to elect Speaker McCarthy. And then we saw it again in the fall of 2023 when the House went several weeks without an elected speaker, with a speaker who had been installed on a temporary basis using, again, a provision of the House rules. That's, I think, our principal topic of conversation today, but a provision of the House rules that had been adopted in the period after the terrorist attacks on September 11th to kind of provide a stopgap in the event that the speaker was dead or incapacitated. And then we sort of saw that provision used for the first time in a very different context, put departing member Patrick McHenry in the speaker's chair as an acting speaker pro tem for several weeks. And so, again, we think about the rules of the House as largely unchanging, largely carried over from one Congress to another, but they can both become quite relevant at particular political moments. And they also can be really important in terms of structuring how the chamber does its work.
Yeah, for sure. And I should note too that we're gonna get into some of the very specific proposals that you were part of. You were part of a group put on by several groups, including the Hoover Institution and Stanford and Sunwater and so forth, about changes that could be made. We're going to focus on ones that the House can do itself, but we are also going to talk about the Senate. And this is a part one, the House, and we'll have a part two next week. So don't worry, Senate people. We will get to you. We will get to the Senate. We will not neglect the Senate. But
I would never neglect the Senate. I am a Senate person
Yes.
at heart.
Yes.
And so I'm really happy to dig into some sort of ideas out there for how the House might work better.
So let's get into it. The report that I've referred to a couple of times is one that came out in September of this year. For those watching on YouTube, I will hold it up. For those who are just listening, I'll describe it. The best part of a podcast, describing something you can't see. But it's Revitalizing the House: Bipartisan Recommendations on Rules and Process, by former members, former staff, and other experts. Molly, you're in the other experts category. Put on by Revitalizing American Institutions, the Hoover Institution, Sunwater Institute, and otherwise concerned citizens, people who have skin in the game. Among them are former members like Jim Cooper, Daniel Lipinski, who's a PhD also.
Also, like
science.
Me,
Yep.
A political scientist.
Yes,
we are happy to claim him as one of our own in the particularly in the set of folks in political science who study the U.S. Congress.
And it's not a bad life after Congress, right? Is going into academics, especially if you've got that sense of things like Lipinski after he lost his primary a couple of years back. But this is a more than 40-page document. It's kind of awesome. But I just want to focus on a couple of things that really are. You've got some ones that are, I think, would make a big difference, but also would require legislation, like increasing members' pay and so forth. So we're going to leave those to the side for just a little bit and focus on the ones that could be done. Some of these could be done without even changing the rules. They could just be instituted through the leadership or through just decisions by individuals in Congress. So let's start with the first one, which is maybe the question that comes up with a lot of people, which is giving members more time for legislative work. I'm going to read just from the executive summary. Fix the House calendar, give members more time for sustained attention to issues by increasing the number of 5-day work weeks per session. Now, even for I think a lot of listeners of political theater, I think most people assume that you work 5 days a week. Now, members of Congress are representing their constituents year-round, 7 days a week. It is not a part-time job. But the number of actual 5-day weeks in Washington working on legislation is relatively rare, especially in a year like this, an election year. Let's talk about this, why this would be so important, because the normal cadence is they come in on a Monday afternoon, they leave Thursday, or they come in late Monday or early Tuesday and leave early Friday. It's usually a 4-day week, and 2 days are basically travel days. They really only have 3 days that they're actually here. And even then we'll get into some of the scheduling conflicts, but what was the impetus for this? Because this comes up a lot, and it's frequently promised, and it's rarely delivered.
Yeah, so there's sort of a couple levels to this. And I'll start with just the idea that if you want members of Congress to be able to just sort of devote sustained attention to the hard work of negotiating legislation, and even working on not especially controversial legislation, things that might have bipartisan support, but that does take time, does take effort. You need them to be able to get together and do that. And having more time in Washington that allows them to do that, I think is sort of one piece of why thinking about having more 5-day work weeks is important. Second is sort of the idea that we think one thing that both facilitates good legislative behavior, so being able to reach compromise on legislation, being able to come up with solutions to the country's problems, is the ability to build relationships between members. And so I don't want to sort of oversell the idea that, there was a glorious time when members were more likely to live in Washington, and that, if I was a member and my kid played on the soccer team with the kid of you who are also a member, that somehow we weren't from the same party, that we had some sort of great, perfect friendship, and that made everything work better. I don't want to sort of romanticize the past too much, but there is a degree to which being able to build face-to-face relationships and spend time together does help members have the kind of just interpersonal relationships that then ultimately facilitate better legislative behavior. And we actually see this. There's some interesting research that looks at members who go on what we call CODELs trips, often internationally, that serve as a really important way for them to connect with one another and then build relationships that pay dividends later in the legislative process. So that's another reason to think about people spending more time in Washington. Two other reasons. One, part of how we got the current calendar that really deprioritizes sustained time in Washington came out of a lot of rhetoric in the particularly accelerating into the mid 90s with the Republicans' takeover of the House in 1994 after having been out of power for a very long time. This rhetoric that sort of Washington is bad. Washington is not a place where you want to spend time. The less time spent in Washington, the better. And that's a really corrosive attitude, a corrosive perspective for the health of the institution. We want members to think that Congress as an institution is something worth investing in and worth kind of spending time in and being acculturated to its norms. And so in that sense, also spending more time in Washington is important. And then the last thing I'll say is just simply from the perspective of this is people's job to be members of Congress. There is value to members in potentially having a more predictable schedule that has some more sustained time in Washington and then also some more sustained time in the district. And so especially if you are a member who is from, say, the West Coast and being able to maximize your time with your family in addition to maximizing your time in Washington does require flying home every weekend. We were talking a little bit before we started recording about Derek Kilmer, representative from Washington, who's retiring, has been really a real driving force in efforts to make the House better and make the House work better over the past several years. And he talks a lot about just the sheer number of hours that he spends flying between Washington, D.C. and Seattle, and then traveling from Seattle to his congressional district in Washington State. And so you can sort of redesign the calendar in a way that both increases the amount of time members spend in Washington and also just gives them more predictability over what their time in their district looks like and what their time in Washington looks like.
Yeah, and I also was struck in the getting a little deeper into the report too, where it stated this isn't every single week will be a 5-day week. This is, how about we try one every month or two. It wasn't this astringent everybody, it almost sounds like some of the debates about return to office, 5 days a week, bah! Yeah, but it's let's bring people back and let's try 1 5-day work week in Washington at a time and see if you like it. It's we'll bring cookies. Okay. Second one, and I feel like this leads the spending more time focusing on legislation, on substantive issues, leads right into this second recommendation that I want to talk about. I've become a little more obsessed about this in my own work life too. Another academic here in the Washington area. He has a podcast, Cal Newport. He's a Georgetown University computer science professor, and he refers to the ability to focus as a superpower. And I think that part of that is, as you said, spending time, which is having time to focus. And then the second part of it is this part of the second recommendation is not being interrupted all the time, not being overscheduled. So the second one is make committees stronger, more substantive, more effective. And the first one, this is the one I want to focus on, reduce member conflicts through block scheduling and a mandatory deconflicting tool, and then publish member attendance at the committee and other levels. And I think that is it sounds so simple. And I think, again, perhaps a layperson listening to this or somebody who's interested in politics but isn't as familiar with Congress would be like, wait, why would they have 2 or 3 committee hearings scheduled at the same time? And it's because they just haven't put in the effort into solving that.
And it's also related to what we were talking about in relation to the first recommendation, which is that when you're only really in Washington for 3 full work days, and sometimes you'll see committees have hearings on a Friday morning before those members leave, but you have fewer days to fit in all of the committee hearings that committees might want to do, and so. The idea of block scheduling here, which is the notion that, there are some committees that are permitted to meet on Tuesdays, and then there are a separate set of committees that are permitted to meet on Wednesdays. This is something that a number of state legislatures do. So I mentioned Mr. Kilmer before. Mr. Kilmer was the chair of the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, which ModCom, which existed for 2 full Congresses, and then in this Congress sort of morphed into a subcommittee of the Committee on House Administration that's focused on implementing a lot of the recommendations made by the ModCom. And one of particularly among the sort of first set of members of the ModCom in the 116th Congress, there were a lot of former state legislatures. And I remember pretty early on in the process, those folks sitting down and saying, wait, in the state legislatures that we came from, that we served in before we came to Washington, we had solved this problem. We had figured out how to have some committees meet on A days. So, and this also feels to me at least similar to the way my middle school scheduled our classes. Like we had A days and we had B days. So the idea would be to just try and reduce the number of conflicts. The deconfliction tool that's referenced in this recommendation is actually something that's been developed and some House committees are using to basically say, this is when we want to have a hearing. We can use this tool to figure out whether there's already something else scheduled that will take the attention and time of the people on our committee, that sort of thing. So the idea would be to sort of make that mandatory. And one of the things that this recommendation also ties into is another recommendation in this section, which is trying to provide more flexibility for how hearings operate. Mm-hmm. So trying to make them less just I am a member and I have 5 minutes of time, and I'm going to use that 5 minutes of time to ask you, the witness, adversarial questions. Sometimes that's a really important thing for a hearing to have and to feature. But we also know that other formats where the conversation is a little bit more free-flowing among members, where it doesn't necessarily just alternate really rigidly between a Democrat and then a Republican, where witnesses maybe have more time than just 5 minutes to give an answer to a question, that other hearing formats, particularly if members are able to stay for a longer period of time at a hearing, they can really, if what you're trying to do is have a hearing that is just trying to illuminate questions and problems as opposed to one that is sort of meant to be more adversarial or more investigatory. You can do that kind of hearing much more easily if you have members who are going to be able to devote longer periods of time to staying in the room, and especially if you try to experiment a little bit with the format for a hearing and just have more conversation and use and again, like not stick to a really rigid seniority-based alternating between the two parties order for questions.
Performative, yeah. It in its worst form, it becomes this performative thing where it's just like back and forth, a ping pong of angry questions. My favorite move, in the absurdity, games is when a member will ask a hostile question and then leave. And then the witness is like left there to answer the question, and the member's left to, I don't know, go to the next committee hearing or just to go to Duncan or whatever. All right, let's get a little bit more into the House, the House floor procedure and getting to the floor, because I think that this is also, the House has such stringent rules about how legislation proceeds to the floor. And it really, I mean, I think, again, a lot of people probably have, a schoolhouse rock, like this is how a bill becomes law. It just, you get people to sign on to things and it just moves to the floor and then it goes to the other chamber and then the president signs it. And that's just not really the case, unless leadership, basically gives its blessing to legislation. It's legislation is hard pressed to move. So we have what's called a discharge petition, where if enough people sign on, more than a majority sign on to a petition to move legislation, they can get it called up. It's still, there's a procedural thing, but there are so many ways that this can also be sabotaged. So let's talk about improving, this is the first thing in the executive summary. I'm jumping around a little bit. Change the rules to give substantial bipartisan majorities greater access to the floor. Improve the discharge petition, giving petition filers the option to collect signatures privately and setting the threshold to a majority of sitting members. Again, I think that this is, when you have to publicly announce like who your signers are, it's sort of almost like a situation where it just gives the leadership a heads up and who they can put the screws to if they don't like what's going on. So let's talk about this recommendation.
Yeah. So it's interesting. The discharge petition signatories on a discharge petition have not always been public. This is actually a change that dates, I think, to the early 90s is when we went from private to public. One of the things that this group recommended is in the task force that generated the recommendations that we're talking about is basically giving the person who is filing the discharge petition, so sort of the sponsor of the discharge petition, the way that we have bill sponsors, the option at the start of the process to either declare, I'm going to make the signatures on this discharge petition public, or I'm going to make them private. And so one of the discharge petition is a pretty rarely used tool to actually get something on the floor. And often when we see a discharge petition either get the required number of signatures or get close to the required number of signatures, we will see the majority party leadership in the House actually choose to either bring up the bill in question anyway, or bring up a related bill that's a little bit different, or somehow try to sort of set aside the effort by rank and file members to use the discharge petition. This is because party leaders in the House hate having their authority undermined. And so if they can figure out a way to accomplish or to sort of meet what what some number of the members are requesting without actually having to formally have their authority undermined, they often prefer to do that. Related to that, members of the majority. So when we see discharge petitions, they're often filed by members of the minority party. Most of their signatories come from the minority party, and majority party members are under a lot of pressure not to sign them because they're seen as a tool for undermining the power of the speaker over the House's agenda. And so the idea here is that if you decided that you thought it would be useful to have the signatories be secret, that might allow more majority party members to sign on to a discharge petition because they wouldn't have to be declaring publicly that they are bucking their party leadership. And so again, I don't. None of the things that we're talking about here are sort of revolutionary for
no, they're not
for improving the way that the House works. But I think this would be a really interesting experiment to see is this. If we allowed members to once again collect discharge petition signatures in secret, would that make it more likely that some particularly majority party members sign on to bills, to discharge petitions, to try and get things onto the floor?
Yeah, I think this is it's not revolutionary. It's just simple, like kind of majority rules, but to be fair to one of the reasons that the House did change its rules, or one of the arguments for it was that this is transparency. That this shouldn't be this murky, smoke-filled room that we just pop something out onto the floor on. I think that that's a valid argument about transparency, but it also, if it is simply used as a cudgel for the leadership to say, nope, we're just going to keep batting this down. Like every time we see like somebody who is brave enough from our party, for whatever reason, whether they think it's the right thing to do or because they're in a district that voted for the presidential nominee of the opposite party, it's become warped to the point where it's almost, you really have to have some political capital or real bravery or just stubbornness in order to sign on to one of these.
Yeah, and I think generally,
if you're in the majority,
generally the recommendations in this report and various things that people have offered to try and make the House work better do have to kind of thread this needle between the value of transparency and also the reality that, especially in our current very highly polarized, very highly partisan Congress, that sometimes what you need to be able to reach a deal is some secrecy, that there are situations where transparency and productivity can be at odds. And so figuring out how to thread that needle is a real challenge for reformers, because one of the I think most important things for reformers to keep in mind is that you kind of have to meet the institution's politics where they are. At the end of the day, you're not going to be able to convince members to do something that they're not convinced is in their political interest. And so figuring out how to kind of marry those incentives is a big challenge when we think about how to make the House and the Senate work better. And so figuring out, again, how to thread that needle between transparency and productivity, I think, is important.
It is. Next one is a new one. This is revolutionary, if you will. It's simply like a proposal to create a new procedure, which you all refer to as the guaranteed regular order. And again, just from the executive summary, empowering committees to advance important bipartisan legislation, particularly on reauthorizations for, say, the Defense Department or farm programs, and to the floor if they conduct a thorough, deliberative process, including hearings and markups. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, so the idea here is that increasingly congressional committees are not spending their time working on legislation. As kind of power over the legislative process has become more centralized in the hands of party leaders, committees are understandably looking at that set of circumstances and saying, why should we invest time in developing legislation? Why should we work really hard to cut really hard deals that sometimes maybe we're not ultimately going to be able to cut anyway? Why should we put in all this effort if the thing that we're going to work on may never see time on the floor? And so for some things like the Farm Bill, the Defense Authorization Bill, things that always get floor time once they're done, either because, like in the case of the Farm Bill, not extending the programs that are authorized by the Farm Bill has big consequences. The case of the NDAA, that we're into, I think, the sixth decade of Congress doing that bill every year. So they're very loath to stop doing it because they have managed to keep doing it every year. But in terms of other things that kind of don't necessarily have that same stature, there's just not the incentive to do the work if you don't think that the thing's ultimately going to come to the floor. And as a result, we see committees spend more time doing oversight than we see them doing legislating. There's a political scientist named John Llewellyn who's kind of documented this really nicely. And so the notion behind this recommendation is that if we can convince committees, if we can tell them, if you do the hard deliberative work of producing a piece of legislation, perhaps especially a piece of legislation that reauthorizes a currently unauthorized program. We've actually started talking in the last several weeks in Washington more about this idea of unauthorized spending. It's a thing that the Elon Musk led the Department of Government Efficiency.
Department in air quotes.
Exactly, not an actual department. Right. But they've been talking a lot about the notion that there is a lot of spending that Congress does every year that is not authorized, that is Congress can do that. They can appropriate money for programs that have not been authorized. That is, it is not how the process was designed to work, but it's not illegal. And so we've been talking about this idea of unauthorized or programs requiring reauthorization a little bit more recently. And so the question is, could you incentivize committees to actually do this work by promising them floor time, and perhaps making the promise of floor time contingent on following particular processes in committee that we think are good, that we think, members from both sides are able to offer amendments, that the bill has had a markup where, where the committee goes through the legislation section by section and offers amendments and that sort of thing. And kind of, can you incentivize what we think is good legislative behavior in committee by promising the ability by the committee to get that thing on the floor when it's actually done. And so that's what we're trying to do in this one.
And it's again, it sounds so basic, right? Like if somebody does the work, then they will be rewarded, right? I mean, it's for an alien beamed here and just, or an AI perhaps, just looking at like the way that we've constructed our society, they'd say like, well, of course that makes sense.
I think a thing that's helpful to remember in the context of this and a number of these other recommendations is that we've gotten a little bit, I think, to a point where members of Congress are just kind of willing to throw up their hands, and that in many cases because they've never served in a Congress that works any differently than the one that we currently have. We've had really large amounts of turnover in the chamber in the past decade or so, especially on the Republican side of the aisle, but this applies to Democrats as well. So we have members who have no idea or have no experience with the institution working in a different way than it does now. And so when you've only ever known, when you've been socialized into a very leadership-centered, leadership-driven legislative process, you don't know kind of what it could look like to do the work in committee, and you don't necessarily have the negotiating tools or the negotiating experience to figure out how to cut these kinds of deals.
Yeah, and I would say too that it is daunting because of the personnel changes and the way things are working now. It seems like we are at a nadir to the point where we think somebody like Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy can solve it, for us by just recommending whatever they're going to recommend. But it was only a few years ago, like a less than 2 decades, that people like Barney Frank and Chris Dodd were having an open process on, completely redoing the way that we regulate the financial system after the 2008, financial collapse. Open process, of people being able to offer amendments on the floor, in subcommittee, in committee, a conference committee, all this kind of stuff. It happened in recent times, even at a time when we had smartphones. So, I think that this is, again, not revolutionary, but just kind of makes sense. And even if it does seem very far removed from where we're at. All right. I want to finish with a favorite of yours.
It is.
This is not a, this is not a call out to any kind of cannabis kind of thing, but it is referred to sometimes has been referred to as the Buds proposal or the Buds resolution out of the House, and it concerns how many people can actually sponsor legislation. And this is your one of your favorite proposals that you came up with.
It is, and it actually it sort of comes out of the same kind of dynamic that we were just talking about, which is that if you want to see different behavior, you have to change the incentives for members to behave differently. And so thinking about guaranteed regular order, if you promise floor time, that changes the incentives for doing the hard work in committee. The Buds resolution, as it has come to be known,
and that's is building understanding through dual sponsors, right?
I think so. I think that's what Buds stands for. There's a whole sort of cottage industry of being able to do these sort of bill names on Capitol Hill. But the idea is that right now, when someone files a piece of legislation, it technically only has one listed sponsor. You can have a whole series of co-sponsors, either at introduction, people can sign on as co-sponsors later. You will often see, and actually the Dodd-Frank example is a good one, you will see legislation sometimes be referred to as belonging to more than one member in our popular conversation about it. In the Dodd-Frank case, Dodd is in the Senate, Frank is in the House. But another pretty famous example is the McCain-Feingold campaign finance legislation. And so McCain and Feingold, senators from both parties, only one of them was technically the lead sponsor of the legislation, but we talked about it as if it belonged to both of them. And so the proposal here is that if you have two members from different parties who've worked together to create a bill, they should get the same formal credit for doing so, on the text of the bill itself, on congress.gov, which then sort of allows the public to know that both of these people were kind of should be evenly credited for doing the work. And the idea is that, if you gave people credit for being equal bipartisan original sponsors, then maybe we would see more of that. And just generally, we want to be able to more clearly trace members' contributions to the legislative process, particularly in a world where increasingly, we've been talking about the defense authorization bill. That bill is almost certainly going to carry with it as part of its text any number of other pieces of legislation that are tangentially related to defense, sometimes not at all, a kind of hitch a ride on a bigger package. And right now we have no great way of giving the members who were responsible for those other pieces of legislation that get hitched on to the NDAA, no great way of giving them credit in the legislative process for what they did. And so there's sort of a set of ways that we could think about trying to change that, trying to improve our ability to trace members' contributions, to incentivize different behavior by giving them credit. And one of them is like a pretty simple idea of being able to formally recognize members of both parties if they want to sort of be equivalent listed sponsors at introduction of a bill.
I could see the government publishing office just saying like, no, we've done it this way for 200 plus years. No, I'm just kidding. I don't want to assume that I know what GPO would do, but you're right. This seems like a simple fix, but it ingrained in our processes for years has just been the single sponsor, and just allowing two people from different parties to be principals sponsors is like, again, this seems like a fairly easy way to generate a lot of goodwill and increase cooperation for things that are important to people. So, all right. Well, Molly, we could go on. I mean, again, this is a fairly extensive document, and of course, this is just one thing that you've worked on over the years. But I think this is a good start, and perhaps if our friends over in the House are listening, these are some of the rules changes we might see. Assuming we can get a speaker on January 3rd when the new Congress is sworn in. But I mean, a lot of this is being debated right now and has been, formulated for a long time. We just saw, though, I like the symmetry here. We just saw the very last House race called by the Associated Press late last night. Adam Gray, a Democrat, won his race against incumbent John Duarte. So now we know the partisan breakdown will be 220 Republicans, 215 Democrats. It's a great time to think about rules changes. And I really appreciate the work you put in here, and also just like your willingness to come on and talk about this on a podcast. We're pretty sure somebody's listening to this.
It's my pleasure. Always happy to dig into the history and to the ways that we can try and make the House work better.
And again, this is just part one. This is perhaps this is, we could call this a new hope for the House, or just home improvements for the House. Next week, you will be back, and we will talk part two, Revenge of the Senate. We'll talk about things that the Senate can do, a little trickier procedurally at times, but We have faith in the Senate, don't we?
We do, and very happy to come back next week and dig into the other chamber.
All right. Well, in the meantime, have a great week. For you listeners out there, thank you for listening, and we will check you out next time on Political Theater.